James Walker stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching softly on the gravel of the parking lot. The mid-December air was crisp, biting at his face as he adjusted his uniform jacket. It wasn't flashy, just the standard issue green, decorated with patches and a few ribbons that hinted at his service overseas. This wasn't the kind of place where he expected fanfare, and honestly, that suited him fine. All James wanted tonight was a quiet meal in the small Indiana town he barely recognized anymore. The diner stood at the corner of Main Street, glowing like a relic from another time. Its neon sign, slightly flickering, spelled out Mary's Diner in cursive letters. The windows framed a cozy scene inside a checkerboard floor, shiny red booths, and a jukebox humming low in the background. James paused for a moment at the entrance, soaking in the scene. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling burgers drifted out as he pushed open the door, ringing the bell overhead. The warmth inside was a sharp contrast to the chill outside, but as soon as James entered, he felt another kind of cold settle over him. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. A couple at the counter glanced at him, their smiles stiffening before they returned to their food. A man in the corner, flipping through a newspaper, froze, his eyes lingering a little too long on James's uniform. James was used to this. He had seen it before in airports and grocery stores. Some people admired the uniform, some felt indifferent, and others, well, they didn't seem to know what to feel. He could sense the unspoken question in the room. What's his story? He nodded politely to no one in particular and made his way to an empty booth by the window. The vinyl seat let out a quiet squeak as he slid in. A waitress appeared moments later, her notepad ready. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and hair pulled into a neat bun. "What can I get for you, hon?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. "A burger, medium well, and a coffee, please," James replied. His voice was steady, but the edge of exhaustion slipped through. She smiled briefly and jotted down the order. "Coming right up." As she walked away, James let out a slow breath and leaned back against the booth. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the diner's charm, the vintage Coca-Cola signs, the black and white photos of smiling families from decades ago, the faint crackle of a radio playing something soft and melodic. It should have felt comforting, but there was a tension in the air he couldn't shake. Near the counter, the diner's manager leaned against the register, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a tall man with a stern face and an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. His gaze was fixed on James, unblinking as if assessing whether the soldier belonged here. James met his eyes briefly, but the manager didn't look away. Instead, he whispered something to a younger employee nearby, and the two exchanged glances. James's stomach tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd felt out of place since returning home. Despite his uniform, or maybe because of it, there were moments like this, moments when the world seemed to view him as a puzzle they couldn't solve. Was he a hero? A burden? Or just another stranger passing through? The waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee, her presence breaking the tension. "Here you go," she said with a smile, setting it down in front of him. "Thank you," James said, his voice soft but sincere. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. "Been cold lately," she remarked, glancing out the window. "Feels like snow's coming." James nodded. "Yeah, maybe." She lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, but then thought better of it. "I'll be back with your burger," she said instead, and walked away. James sipped his coffee, savoring the bitter warmth as it settled in his chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner's windows. Inside, the quiet hum of conversation resumed, though James could still feel the occasional glance in his direction. The manager's gaze, however, never wavered. James closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to relax. He hadn't come here to draw attention or cause a stir. He just wanted a meal, something simple, something normal. But as the minutes ticked by, he began to realize that normal might be a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. As James Walker sat at his booth, sipping his coffee, he couldn't help but feel the quiet weight of the room settle over him. The diner's charm was undeniable, straight out of a postcard from the 1950s. The red vinyl booths gleamed under soft fluorescent lights, and the jukebox tucked in the corner hummed a tune so faint it was barely noticeable. The air smelled of fresh burgers, crispy fries, and warm pie. It was the kind of place that should have felt comforting, a pocket of Americana preserved in time. But for James, the warmth was hollow, the charm distant. The waitress moved through the room with practiced grace, balancing plates and exchanging easy smiles with the other patrons. Her warm demeanor contrasted sharply with the wary glances that flickered toward James, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't hostility, at least not overt, but the kind of guarded curiosity that made his presence feel less like an ordinary diner visit and more like an unspoken event. A young couple near the counter whispered to each other, stealing glances at James as they stirred cream into their coffee. An older man in a trucker's cap, sitting at a table by the jukebox, looked him over briefly before resuming his meal. None of them lingered long, but the cumulative effect of those small moments was hard to ignore. At the front of the diner, the manager's gaze remained steady. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, his expression unreadable but far from welcoming. James tried to dismiss the tension in the man's stance, telling himself it was nothing more than coincidence, but the scrutiny was palpable. The man's eyes followed him, sharp and unrelenting, as if trying to piece together who James was and why he was here. The waitress returned, carrying a plate with his burger and fries. "Here you go, Han," she said with a smile, setting the plate down gently in front of him. "Need anything else?" James shook his head. "This is perfect, thank you." His voice was steady, though the weight of the room pressed on his chest. She lingered for a moment, adjusting the silverware on his table unnecessarily. "We don't see a lot of folks in uniform around here," she said softly, almost apologetically. James managed a small smile. "I guess I don't blend in too well, huh?" Her cheeks reddened slightly, and she gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, it's not that. It's just, well, thank you for your service." The words came out hurried, like she was afraid she might say the wrong thing. "You enjoy your meal, okay?" He nodded, his smile fading as she walked away. Her kindness felt genuine, but it couldn't erase the tension in the air. James picked up his burger, taking a bite and savoring the familiar taste. It was good comfort food at its finest, but his appetite was dulled by the unspoken questions that lingered in the room. As he chewed, James's eyes wandered to the framed photographs on the wall. Families smiling in front of classic cars, soldiers waving from parade floats, children licking ice cream cones on sunlit afternoons. It was a gallery of simpler times, moments captured in black and white and frozen in an era that seemed untouched by war or hardship. James felt a pang of longing not for those particular times, but for a version of life where he didn't feel so out of place. The jukebox crackled as the song changed, a slower tune filling the space. James let his gaze drift back to the window, watching the faint reflection of the diner's interior against the darkened street outside. Snowflakes began to fall, swirling lazily in the glow of the streetlights. For a moment, he let himself focus on the quiet beauty of it, a rare reprieve from the noise that usually filled his mind. But the moment didn't last. The manager's voice cut through the low murmur of the diner, louder than necessary as he spoke to a busboy near the counter. "You see that guy over there?" he asked, his tone edged with something that made James's stomach tighten. The busboy glanced briefly in James's direction before looking back at the manager. "Yeah," he said quietly, almost hesitant. The manager's response was muffled, but the busboy nodded, stealing another glance at James before walking away. James caught the exchange and felt his chest tighten further. He wasn't here to cause trouble, just to eat a meal, maybe find a sliver of normalcy in a life that felt anything but. But the air in the diner had shifted, and James knew all too well the kind of tension that could follow. He set his coffee cup down carefully, his fingers steady despite the growing unease. His mind replayed scenes from the past moments when every glance, every small movement carried weight, when the wrong reaction could mean everything. This wasn't the battlefield, but the instincts honed there were hard to shake. The bell over the door jingled as a family walked in, a young mother with 2 kids, their laughter momentarily breaking the heavy silence. The waitress greeted them warmly, leading them to a booth on the far side of the room. James watched as they settled in, the kids' chatter filling the air like a bomb. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the tension might dissolve, the room returning to the easy rhythm it had before he walked in. But then he caught the manager's gaze again, and the unease settled back into place, heavier than before. James Walker tried to focus on the burger in front of him, but each bite felt heavier than the last. The room was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the aroma of sizzling grease or the warmth of the diner's interior. It was the kind of silence that wasn't silent at all, filled instead with glances, whispers, and the unspoken questions hanging in the air. The manager hadn't moved from his post at the counter. His gaze bore into James like a spotlight, unrelenting and invasive. The waitress, kind as she had been, kept her distance now, her eyes flickering toward James's table only when necessary. It wasn't outright hostility, it was something more subtle, more insidious. It was the kind of discomfort that made people lower their voices and avert their eyes, pretending not to notice the very thing they couldn't stop noticing. James set his burger down and reached for his coffee. The warmth of the mug in his hands offered little comfort against the cold knot forming in his chest. His mind began to wander, drifting back to the desert heat, the endless stretches of sand, the chaos of orders shouted over the roar of helicopters. Out there, his uniform meant something clear: respect, camaraderie, purpose. Here, it seemed to mean something entirely different, something he couldn't quite pin down but felt deeply nonetheless. At a nearby booth, the young couple from earlier continued their whispered conversation. The man, maybe in his early 20s, leaned in close to his partner, his voice low but audible enough to reach James in snatches. "Do you think he's seen action?" The man murmured. "I mean, look at him. He's gotta have, right?" The woman nudged him sharply with her elbow, her face flushing. "Shh, don't stare. It's rude." "I'm not staring," the man protested, though his eyes darted back toward James's table. "I'm just saying, you don't see a guy like that every day." James pretended not to hear, but the words settled like stones in his stomach. He took another sip of coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn slightly on its way down. He wasn't angry at them, how could he be? They were young, likely untouched by the realities of war, and their curiosity was innocent if a bit clumsy. Still, their words carried a weight he wasn't ready to unpack tonight. From the corner of his eye, James noticed the busboy approaching with a dish rag slung over his shoulder. The young man, barely old enough to shave, fidgeted nervously, his sneakers squeaking softly against the floor. He stopped a few feet from James's table, shifting his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. Do you need anything, sir?" the busboy asked, his voice cracking slightly. His eyes darted to the half-empty coffee mug in James's hand. James glanced up, offering a polite smile. "No, I'm good. Thanks." The boy nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and scurried back toward the kitchen. James watched him go, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name: sympathy, perhaps, or maybe just weariness. The boy's unease mirrored the atmosphere of the entire room, a reflection of a tension that seemed to grow with each passing moment. Outside, the snow began to fall more steadily, the flakes thick and heavy as they swirled under the glow of the streetlights. James turned his gaze to the window, letting the sight of the snowfall pull him out of the moment, if only briefly. For a few seconds, he allowed himself to imagine that he was somewhere else, anywhere else. A place where the stairs didn't linger, where his uniform didn't carry the weight of assumptions and unspoken judgments. But the quiet didn't last. The bell above the door jingled again, and James turned his head slightly to see who had entered. It was a middle-aged man, his face weathered and lined, his coat dusted with snow. He glanced around the diner, his eyes landing on James for just a moment before moving on. Unlike the others, his expression didn't hold suspicion or curiosity, just a quiet acknowledgement, a subtle nod that James returned without thinking. The exchange, brief as it was, felt like a lifeline. It reminded James that not everyone in this room saw him as an outsider or an enigma. There were still people who understood, even if they didn't say it out loud. As the man took a seat at the counter, James turned his attention back to his meal, forcing himself to take another bite. The burger was still warm, the fries crisp, but the food might as well have been tasteless. His appetite had fled long ago, chased away by the weight of the stairs, the whispers, the manager's unyielding scrutiny. James set down his fork, folding his hands on the table as he stared into his coffee cup. He thought of the men and women he had served alongside, of the sacrifices they had made, of the unspoken bond that had carried them through the darkest of days. He thought of Corporal Daniel Carter, whose letter was still tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The words in that letter felt heavier now, pressing against his chest, like a reminder of everything he carried not just for himself, but for those who couldn't carry it anymore. The room buzzed faintly with conversation, but to James, it felt like he was sitting in the eye of a storm. And he knew, deep down, that the real storm was just beginning. James Walker sat with his hands loosely clasped around the coffee cup, the faint warmth now barely noticeable. The air in the diner felt heavier, as if the room had collectively drawn a breath and was holding it, waiting for something to tip the balance. His plate, though still half full, had lost its appeal. Food was supposed to be comforting, grounding. But tonight, the burger and fries on his plate might as well have been a reminder of how far he was from feeling settled. He lifted his eyes and found the manager staring again, his posture rigid and unyielding behind the counter. The man wasn't trying to hide it anymore. His gaze was direct, almost confrontational, and carried with it an edge that made James's jaw tighten. This wasn't simple curiosity or even quiet discomfort. This was something sharper, something James couldn't ignore. The waitress approached the counter, holding an empty coffee pot in one hand. Her steps faltered slightly as she caught sight of the manager's expression. She hesitated, glancing between him and James before continuing her path. As she reached the counter, she whispered something too low for James to hear, her brows knitting together in what looked like concern. The manager shook his head, his lips forming a thin line. Whatever she had said didn't seem to change his mind. James looked back down at his coffee, resisting the urge to glance around the room again. He could feel the unease pressing in on him from all sides, the weight of unspoken words and silent judgments. He'd been in situations like this before, not in diners, but in places far more dangerous, where tension simmered just below the surface until it boiled over. His training told him to stay calm, to assess, to not let the environment dictate his emotions. But here, in this small Indiana town where he'd hoped to find a sliver of peace, it felt deeply personal. The bell above the door jingled as another customer walked in, momentarily drawing the attention of the room. A woman, perhaps in her late 30s, stepped inside, bundled in a thick coat dusted with snow. She was carrying a small child, no older than 3, who clung to her shoulder with sleepy eyes and rosy cheeks. The sight should have softened the atmosphere, but the tension didn't lift. It merely shifted, like a cloud stubbornly refusing to break apart. The woman gave a polite nod to the waitress before heading to a booth on the opposite side of the diner. James watched her for a moment, noting the way she gently settled the child into the seat, brushing snowflakes from his hair. The tenderness of the gesture pulled at something deep within him, a quiet ache that he couldn't quite place. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the manager's voice, louder now, cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Excuse me," the manager said, stepping out from behind the counter. His tone was sharp, carrying an authority that felt out of place in a room meant for comfort and hospitality. He was walking toward James, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried, each step a reminder that this moment was no longer avoidable. James straightened slightly in his seat, his shoulders instinctively squaring as the man approached. Years of discipline kept his expression calm, but inside, a flicker of frustration stirred. He didn't want to be the center of attention, didn't want to feel like he had to defend his presence in a place as ordinary as a diner. But here it was, unfolding in front of him whether he wanted it or not. The manager stopped a few feet from the table, crossing his arms over his chest. His stance was rigid, his expression unreadable except for the faint trace of suspicion in his eyes. "Can I help you?" James asked, his voice measured and steady, though there was no mistaking the edge of caution behind it. The manager didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at James's plate, then back up at him, his jaw tightening. "Look," he began, his tone clipped. "I'm not sure what you're doing here, but we reserve the right to refuse service." James's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and disbelief crossing his face. He stared at the man for a moment, trying to process what he'd just heard. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "but is there a problem?" The manager shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable under James's steady gaze. "No problem," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just, well, maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." James's heart sank. He'd prepared himself for many things when he returned home: awkward conversations, lingering stares, even the occasional thoughtless comment. But this was different. This was rejection, plain and simple, wrapped in a thin veneer of politeness that only made it sting more. The room seemed to hold its breath, the quiet hum of conversation fading into nothingness. The waitress, standing near the counter, looked stricken, her hands clutching the coffee pot tightly. The young mother glanced up from her booth, her expression a mixture of confusion and quiet disapproval. Even the busboy, who had been stacking plates a moment earlier, paused mid-motion, his eyes darting nervously between James and the manager. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His instinct was to respond, to push back, but he knew that anger wouldn't help here. Instead, he looked the manager directly in the eye and said, "I just came here for a meal. That's all." The manager hesitated, his resolve faltering for the briefest of moments. But whatever internal conflict he might have felt didn't show on his face. "Like I said," he replied, his voice firm but quieter now, "we reserve the right to refuse service." The air in the diner was heavy, each second stretching longer than the last as James Walker held the manager's gaze. The low murmur of voices had dwindled to an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint clink of dishes from the kitchen. The manager's words, his polite yet cutting refusal, hung in the air like a challenge, daring James to respond. James sat back slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. His posture was calm, almost disarmingly so, but his mind raced with emotions he fought to contain. Frustration. Hurt. A deep, gnawing disbelief that this was happening in the very country he'd served to protect. He took a slow breath, his voice steady, but carrying the unmistakable weight of his exhaustion. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, his tone measured. "I came here for dinner like anyone else. Why exactly am I being asked to leave?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, his folded arms tightening against his chest, as though bracing himself. "It's nothing personal," he said, though his stiff demeanor betrayed him. "We just have a policy. We don't have to explain." James's brow furrowed, his expression calm but resolute. "It feels personal," he said quietly. His words weren't confrontational, but there was no mistaking the depth of their meaning. The silence that followed was palpable. Across the room, the young mother who had entered earlier looked up from her booth, her eyes flicking nervously between James and the manager. She leaned forward slightly, her hand instinctively resting on her child's shoulder, as if she was bracing herself for what might come next. The waitress, who had been lingering near the counter, stepped forward, her face pale and drawn. "Maybe we could." "I mean, he's just having a meal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Her attempt to mediate was met with a sharp glance from the manager. "Stay out of it," he snapped, the sharpness of his tone cutting through the room. The waitress flinched, her hands gripping the coffee pot tightly. James watched the exchange, his stomach sinking. This wasn't just about him. The tension in the diner wasn't just his burden to carry, it was spilling over, pulling everyone into its orbit. He could see it in the waitress's anxious movements, the busboy's nervous glances, the uneasy shifting of patrons in their seats. "Look," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted a quiet dinner. But if there's a reason why you think I don't belong here, I'd like to hear it." The manager hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed as though he might back down, but then his resolve hardened. "You're making people uncomfortable," he said bluntly. His words landed like a blow, heavier than anything James had expected. James blinked, momentarily stunned. "Uncomfortable," he repeated, his voice quieter now, as though testing the word to see if it made any sense at all. The manager gestured vaguely toward the room. "You walk in here wearing that uniform," he said, his tone growing defensive, "and people don't know what to think. They don't know your story. They don't know if you're stable." The words hung in the air, and James felt his chest tighten, his breath catching for just a moment. There it was, the unspoken fear that followed so many veterans home. The assumptions, the stereotypes, the quiet doubts whispered behind closed doors. The idea that wearing the uniform didn't just make you different, it made you dangerous. The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes now focused on James. He could feel the tension building, the unspoken judgment thickening the air. But instead of letting anger take over, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Stable?" he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice that had brought him here. "I've served this country for the last 10 years. I've stood shoulder to shoulder with men and women who've given everything to protect the freedom we all take for granted. I've seen things I wouldn't wish on anyone, and I've done it willingly because I believed it mattered. So you'll have to excuse me if I don't take kindly to being told I make people uncomfortable." The room was silent, the weight of James's words settling over everyone like a blanket of snow. Even the young couple near the counter, who had been whispering earlier, now sat quietly, their eyes wide and uncertain. James reached into the pocket of his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. From within, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and creased from being handled too many times. He placed it gently on the table, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before he looked back up at the manager. "This," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "is a letter from the family of a man I served with, Corporal Daniel Carter. He didn't make it home. But his family wanted me to know how much they appreciated the sacrifices we made for them, and for everyone else in this room. I carry it with me to remind myself why I keep going, why I'm still here." The manager stared at the letter, his expression unreadable. Around the room, the tension began to shift, not dissipating entirely, but softening, bending under the weight of James's quiet strength. The young mother at the booth reached for her wallet, pulling out a few bills and placing them on the edge of her table. "I'll pay for his meal," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly but filled with conviction. The words cut through the silence, and for the first time that evening, James felt something other than tension. He felt the faint stirrings of hope. The diner was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner, its once cheerful tune now feeling like a whisper against the weight in the room. All eyes were on James Walker as he sat there, his uniform a stark reminder of the world beyond the diner's warm walls. The letter he had placed on the table was small and worn, but it carried a gravity that words alone couldn't convey. The young mother who had offered to pay for James's meal sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She avoided the gaze of the manager, who now stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as though searching for words he couldn't find. Her whispered gesture of support had shattered the tension, leaving behind a quiet unease as people processed what they had just witnessed. James's voice, low but unwavering, broke the silence. "You know," he began, his fingers tracing the edge of the folded letter, "when I was overseas, I didn't think much about what it would be like to come home. You focus on surviving, on getting through the next day, the next mission. You tell yourself that when you finally step back onto American soil, everything will feel normal again." His eyes filled with a quiet pain, lifted to meet the manager's. "But that's not how it works. You come back, and nothing feels the same. Not the streets you grew up on, not the people you used to know, and definitely not the places that were supposed to feel like home." The manager shifted on his feet, his arms uncrossing as he looked at James with an expression that was no longer stern but hesitant, almost apologetic. The room hung on every word, the patrons no longer whispering or glancing nervously. They were listening now, truly listening. James unfolded the letter slowly, the creases so deeply worn that the paper threatened to tear. He held it up for a moment, as if offering it to the room before his voice softened further, filled with emotion. "This letter is from Corporal Daniel Carter's family. He served with me, and he didn't make it home. His parents wrote this to thank me for bringing back his things, for being with him in his final moments. They told me how proud they were of their son, how they'd trade anything to have one more day with him." The words caught in his throat, but James pressed on, his voice trembling just enough to remind everyone in the room that he wasn't just a soldier, he was human, carrying the weight of loss that few could understand. "They said something in this letter that I think about every day," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the diner. "We don't take for granted the freedom Daniel fought for, and we pray that others won't either." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, their meaning sinking into the hearts of everyone listening. A soft sniffle broke the silence. The waitress, standing near the counter, dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron. Even the busboy, who had been pretending to clean a table nearby, had stopped moving, his young face drawn with an emotion he didn't quite know how to express. The manager, no longer the towering figure of authority he had been moments ago, took a step back and let out a shaky breath. "I didn't mean," he began, his voice faltering. I didn't think." James gave him a small, understanding nod, though his expression remained serious. "I know you didn't mean to," he said gently. "Most people don't. They don't realize how much a glance, a word, or even just an attitude can carry weight. But it does. It always does." The young mother, her child now fast asleep in her arms, looked at James with tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling but filled with sincerity. "Thank you for everything you've done for all of us." James nodded, his throat tightening as he tried to respond. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Around the room, the mood began to shift. The tension that had lingered for so long started to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of unity. People who had been avoiding eye contact now looked at James directly, their expressions filled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. The young couple near the counter reached for their wallets, whispering to the waitress that they wanted to help cover James's tab. The older man in the trucker's cap gave a small nod of respect before turning back to his plate, his movements slower now, as if lost in thought. The manager took another step back, his hands falling to his sides. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low but sincere. "I shouldn't have treated you like that." James studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "It's not just about the apology," he said quietly. "It's about what comes next. How we treat each other, how we remember what really matters. That's what makes the difference." The manager nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly as he seemed to take in the weight of James's words. "You're right," he said, almost to himself. As the silence settled once more, the snowfall outside grew heavier, blanketing the streets in white. Inside the diner, however, there was a new warmth, a shared understanding that hadn't been there before. James folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket, his movements deliberate, as if sealing away not just a piece of paper, but a piece of himself. The diner felt different now. The heavy tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud was lifting, replaced by a quieter, more introspective atmosphere. James Walker sat back slightly in his booth, his fingers brushing the edge of his folded letter before tucking it into his jacket pocket. Around him, the room seemed to breathe again, though the silence carried a new weight, one of reflection, rather than unease. The young mother, still cradling her sleeping child, glanced toward James with an expression that was both tender and apologetic. Her earlier offer to pay for his meal had been a small gesture, but in the stillness of the moment it felt monumental. She caught his eye and mouthed, "Thank you." James gave her a small nod, his throat tight with emotion. The waitress, her eyes red-rimmed but kind, approached James cautiously, holding the now empty coffee pot as though it were a shield. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice soft and trembling. "Would you like a refill?" she asked, her words carrying more than just the offer of coffee. It was an olive branch, a small way to make amends for the earlier discomfort. James smiled faintly and slid his mug toward her. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but warm. As she poured, she glanced at him, her gaze filled with something akin to reverence. "You've been through so much," she said quietly, almost to herself. I can't imagine what that must be like." James's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "You learn to carry it," he replied after a pause. "Some days are heavier than others, but you carry it because you have to. Because there are people who can't anymore." Her hands trembled slightly as she set the pot down, but she met his gaze with newfound determination. "Well, I just want you to know. We're grateful. I'm grateful." James nodded, his chest tightening again, not with anger or hurt this time, but with gratitude for the simple kindness in her words. It was a reminder that even in the most challenging moments, humanity had a way of breaking through. At the counter, the young couple whispered to each other again, their earlier curiosity now replaced by quiet admiration. The man leaned toward the waitress as she passed, slipping a few extra bills into her hand. "Put it toward his meal," he said, his voice low but firm. His partner nodded in agreement, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Nearby, the busboy hovered awkwardly by the kitchen door, his expression a mixture of shame and curiosity. He shuffled forward hesitantly, clearing his throat. "Mr. Sir," he began, his voice cracking slightly. James turned toward him, his expression patient. The boy's hands fidgeted with the towel slung over his shoulder. I didn't mean to. I didn't know what to say before," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "But I think it's really cool what you've done. Serving and all that." James smiled gently, the corners of his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Thank you," he said simply. "It means a lot." The boy nodded quickly, his face reddening as he retreated to the kitchen. The small interaction might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to James it felt like a ripple in a larger tide. Every word, every glance, every gesture, each one chipped away at the invisible wall that had surrounded him when he first walked into the diner. The older man in the trucker's cap, who had been silently observing from his booth, finally spoke up. His voice was gravelly but steady, carrying the weight of years behind it. "You know, I serve too," he said, his words cutting through the quiet like a beacon. "Back in Nam. And let me tell you, coming home wasn't easy then either." All eyes turned toward him, the room hanging on his words. He looked at James with a mix of understanding and respect. "But it's different now," he continued. "People like you. You're changing things. You're showing folks what it means to wear that uniform." James met his gaze, the unspoken bond between them filling the space like a bridge. "Thank you for your service," James said sincerely, his voice carrying the weight of one soldier to another. The older man nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line as if holding back emotion. "Same to you," he replied gruffly, turning back to his meal with a quiet dignity. The snowfall outside grew heavier, the flakes swirling under the soft glow of the streetlights. Inside the diner, the warmth that had been absent when James first arrived now filled every corner. It wasn't just the heat from the kitchen or the faint hum of the jukebox, it was the shared humanity of a room full of strangers who had been reminded, in the span of a few moments, of the sacrifices made for their freedom. The manager, still standing by the counter, looked at James with an expression that was no longer defensive, but deeply introspective. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something he hadn't been able to see before. James returned the nod, a quiet understanding passing between them. It wasn't an apology, not in words, but it was a start. And sometimes that was enough. The diner buzzed with a new energy, now quieter, but undeniably alive. Conversations were softer, more thoughtful, as if everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. The invisible barrier that had separated James Walker from the rest of the room was crumbling, piece by piece, with every shared glance, and whispered word of gratitude. The young mother carefully adjusted the blanket around her sleeping child, her gaze drifting toward James. Her earlier offer to pay for his meal had been a small gesture, but the impact lingered, visible in the way her shoulders had relaxed, as though she had finally done something that felt meaningful. She reached for her purse, pulling out a few more bills, and signaled the waitress. "Here," she said softly, pressing the money into the waitress's hand. "For his meal. And the next coffee he orders, too." The waitress blinked, her tired face lighting up with a warmth that seemed to spread through her whole demeanor. "That's kind of you," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "It's the least I can do," the young mother replied. She glanced back at James, her expression one of quiet determination. "He's done enough for all of us." Across the room, the older man in the trucker's cap pushed his plate aside and leaned back in his chair. He watched James with a mix of admiration and nostalgia, his own memories seemingly stirred by the younger soldier's presence. After a moment, he stood up, adjusting the brim of his cap, and approached James's booth. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but kind. James gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Not at all," he said, his tone inviting despite the weariness in his eyes. The man slid into the booth, his movements deliberate, as though he was carrying more than just physical weight. "Name's Frank," he said, extending a calloused hand. "James," he replied, shaking Frank's hand firmly. Frank nodded, studying James for a moment. "Heard what you said earlier," he began, his tone measured. "About carrying the weight. You're right, it never really leaves you. But you keep carrying it because, well, because you have to. People like us don't get to set it down." James's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Vietnam?" he asked. Frank nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stared past James, lost in a memory only he could see. 50 years ago," he said quietly. "Feels like yesterday sometimes. The noise, the heat, the faces of the guys I left behind." His voice wavered, but he steadied himself. "Coming back was the hardest part. People didn't look at us the way they look at you now." James tilted his head slightly, his curiosity piqued. "How did they look at you? Like we were the enemy," Frank said bluntly, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Like we were the ones who started the war, not the ones sent to fight it." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "But seeing you here tonight, it gives me hope. Maybe things really are changing." James nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "I hope so." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the waitress clearing her throat. She stood at the edge of the table, holding a plate of pie. Her cheeks were flushed, and she looked almost nervous, as though she wasn't sure how her gesture would be received. "This is on the house," she said, placing the plate in front of James. "Apple pie. Fresh today." James looked up at her, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time that evening. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The waitress hesitated, then added, "And I'm sorry. For earlier. For not saying something sooner." James shook his head gently. "You didn't have to," he said. "You've been kind. That means more than you know." The moment was simple but profound, and the atmosphere in the diner shifted again. Kindness, once withheld, was now being offered freely, each gesture building on the last. The young couple at the counter, who had been whispering earlier, approached James's table as well. "Hey," the man began awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "We, just wanted to say thank you for your service. And we're sorry if we stared before." We didn't mean anything by it." His partner nodded quickly, her cheeks pink with embarrassment. We didn't know what to say. But we're really grateful." James looked at them both, his smile gentle. "Thank you," he said simply. "And it's okay. It's not easy to know what to say sometimes." The couple exchanged relieved smiles before retreating to their seats. James watched them go, his heart lighter than it had been all evening. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just a stranger passing through. He was part of something bigger, a community waking up to the quiet strength of understanding and gratitude. As Frank rose from the booth, he placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You take care of yourself, son," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You too, Frank," James replied, his tone carrying the weight of respect. Frank nodded once before heading for the door, his figure silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights as he stepped outside into the swirling snow. James took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The world outside was still cold, still uncertain. But inside the diner, something had changed. And for the first time, James allowed himself to believe that change was possible not just for him, but for everyone. As Frank disappeared into the snowy night, James Walker leaned back in his booth, the pie in front of him untouched for now. The room was quieter, but it was no longer tense. The energy in the diner had shifted into something deeper, reflective, almost reverent. The stares James had felt earlier, heavy with suspicion and discomfort, were gone. In their place was a warmth that felt fragile but sincere, like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. The waitress returned to his table, her movements more confident now. She carried a fresh pot of coffee, her smile small but genuine. "Would you like a warm-up?" she asked softly. James nodded, pushing his mug toward her. "Thanks." As she poured, she glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, her voice hesitant, "my brother served too. Over in Iraq. He's back now, but he's different. He doesn't really talk about it much. I guess I didn't really know how to help him before. But listening to you tonight, I think I get it a little more." James looked up at her, his eyes softening. "It's hard to know what to say," he admitted. "Sometimes just being there letting him know he's not alone is enough." Her hand trembled slightly as she set the pot down. "I'll try," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "For everything," he nodded, his gratitude unspoken but evident in his expression. As she walked away, he felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. It wasn't just his own struggles that mattered tonight. It was the way those struggles connected him to others, how they could inspire even the smallest steps toward healing. The young mother, still cradling her child, rose from her booth. She approached James cautiously, her movements careful so as not to wake the sleeping boy in her arms. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the hum of the jukebox. James looked up, his face open and inviting. "Yes," she smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to her son before meeting James's eyes again. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for your service, but for tonight. My son's too young to understand now, but one day I'll tell him about this. About the man who reminded us what courage and kindness look like." James's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. Finally, he managed, "Thank you. That means a lot." The woman hesitated, then shifted her son in her arms so she could extend her hand. James shook it gently, his grip firm but kind. She returned to her booth, her steps lighter, her shoulders no longer weighed down by the burden of the moment. At the counter, The young couple exchanged quiet words before the man stood and approached James. His partner stayed seated, her hands nervously twisting her scarf. The man paused a few feet from the booth, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Hey," he began awkwardly, his voice low. I wanted to say sorry. For earlier. We didn't mean to stare or, It's just, seeing you walking like that, it kind of made me think about my grandfather. He served in World War II, but we never really talked about it. I think maybe we should have." James studied the young man for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It's not too late," he said gently. "If he's still around, ask him. Listen to what he's willing to share. It might surprise you." The man nodded, a small smile breaking through his nervousness. "Thanks. I think I will." As he walked back to his seat, James allowed himself a moment to breathe. The tension that had gripped him since he walked into the diner was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He hadn't planned to be anyone's teacher tonight, but somehow that's exactly what he had become. The manager, who had been standing silently by the counter, finally stepped forward. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at James with an expression that was equal parts regret and humility. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but steady. "The way I treated you when you came in, it wasn't right. I let my own ignorance get in the way of treating you with the respect you deserve." James regarded him calmly, his gaze unwavering. "It's not just about me," he said quietly. "It's about anyone who walks through your door. Everyone deserves respect, whether they're wearing a uniform or not." The manager nodded slowly, his face flushed with shame. "You're right," he admitted. "I need to do better. Not just with you, but with everyone." James's expression softened, and he extended his hand. The manager took it hesitantly, then shook it firmly. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a small but meaningful step toward change. Around the diner, patrons watched the exchange in silence. Some nodded in approval, while others simply returned to their meals, their expressions thoughtful. The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the street in a quiet serenity that mirrored the mood inside. James picked up his fork and took a bite of the pie. It was warm and sweet, the kind of comfort he hadn't realized he needed until that moment. As he chewed, he looked around the room, taking in the faces of strangers who no longer felt like strangers. Tonight had started as just another stop on his journey, another meal in a long line of meals. But now it felt like something more. It was a reminder that even in the smallest places, even in the quietest moments, change was possible. James Walker took another bite of the warm apple pie, savoring its sweetness as a rare moment of peace settled over him. The diner, once charged with tension and discomfort, now felt like a completely different place. Conversations resumed at a quiet hum, but they carried a weight of reflection, of people reassessing their assumptions and choices in light of what they had just witnessed. The young mother was now bundling her child in a thick coat, preparing to leave. She glanced back at James one last time, her expression soft but resolute. "Good night," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of gratitude. "Good night," James replied, nodding. As the door jingled behind her, he realized how deeply her quiet gesture of kindness had touched him. She didn't need to say much, her actions spoke louder than words. The manager, who had apologized earlier, stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold with a contemplative expression. He still hadn't fully relaxed, as if he were trying to come to terms with the lesson James had offered him. His gaze met James's, and he gave a small, hesitant nod, a silent acknowledgement of the need for change. James returned the nod, knowing it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about planting a seed, hoping it would grow into something better. Change was never immediate, but small moments like these had a way of rippling outward. Frank, the older veteran, had left a while ago, but his words lingered in James's mind. "You're showing folks what it means to wear that uniform." It was a weighty sentiment, one that James wasn't sure he fully deserved, but it reminded him of the responsibility he carried not just as a soldier, but as a human being trying to navigate a world that didn't always understand. The young couple who had nervously approached him earlier now looked more at ease. The man had his arm around his partner, and they shared a quiet smile. They glanced in James's direction, and the man gave him a small wave. James raised his hand in return, his heart lightened by the genuine connection that had formed in the most unexpected of places. The waitress returned to James's table, her steps confident but not rushed. "How's the pie?" she asked with a hint of a smile. "Perfect," James said, his tone warm. "Thank you." She hesitated for a moment, then pulled a small notepad from her apron. "I've been thinking about something you said earlier," she began, her voice soft but steady. "About how everyone deserves respect, no matter what they're wearing." That hit me. I've worked here for years, and I've seen all kinds of people come through that door. Some of them were easy to serve, and some weren't. But I think I've been quick to judge sometimes. James looked at her, his expression encouraging. "It's not easy," he said gently, "but every small step matters. Sometimes just pausing to listen or to see someone for who they really are can make all the difference." She nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I'll try," she promised. "And not just here. With my brother, too. Maybe he doesn't need me to have all the answers. Maybe he just needs to know I care." "You'd be surprised how far that goes," James replied. The busboy, who had been hovering near the kitchen, stepped forward timidly. His face was flushed, but his determination was clear. Sir," he began, addressing James. "I just wanted to say thanks. For, everything you said. It made me think. Maybe I should do something too. Like, maybe help out at the shelter downtown or something." James's smile widened. "That's a great idea," he said. "Helping others, it doesn't matter how you do it. What matters is showing up." The busboy nodded, his face brightening with a shy smile, before he retreated back to the kitchen. James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not for himself, but for the way the room had transformed. What had started as a quiet attempt to grab a meal had turned into something much bigger, something that might linger long after he left. The snow outside had slowed, leaving a pristine blanket over the streets. The bell above the door jingled as another patron entered, a middle-aged man shaking the snow from his coat. He glanced around the room, taking in the calm but reflective atmosphere, and quickly found a seat at the counter. The waitress greeted him with the same warmth she had shown James, a subtle but significant shift in how she approached her work. James finished his pie, the sweetness lingering as he set his fork down. He reached for his wallet, but the waitress waved him off. "It's covered," she said firmly. "Let us do this for you." He hesitated, then nodded, understanding the gesture for what it was: a collective offering, a way for the room to say thank you in a language beyond words. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for this, but for tonight." The waitress smiled, her eyes bright. "We should be thanking you." James stood, slipping on his jacket and adjusting the collar. He glanced around the room one last time, taking in the faces of people who now felt more like neighbors than strangers. As he stepped toward the door, he turned back, his gaze meeting the manager's. "It's not about being perfect," James said, his tone gentle but firm. It's about being willing to try. That's what makes the difference. The manager nodded, his expression resolute. I'll remember that. With that, James stepped out into the night. The cold air hit him, sharp but invigorating, as he walked toward his truck. The snow crunched under his boots, and the quiet of the town seemed almost sacred in its stillness. He climbed into the driver's seat, the warmth of the diner still lingering in his chest. Tonight hadn't been what he'd expected, but it had been what he needed, a reminder that even in the smallest, most unassuming places, there was room for understanding, for growth, and for change. As he drove away, the lights of the diner fading in his rearview mirror, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever came next. The truck's engine rumbled softly as James Walker drove through the snow-covered streets, the headlights casting long shadows against the quiet town. The lights of the diner faded into the distance, but the warmth of the evening lingered in his heart. It wasn't just the pie or the kindness of strangers, it was the sense that something had shifted, not only in that room, but also in himself. He thought about Frank, the older veteran who had shared his own struggles and left James with words that echoed in his mind. You're showing folks what it means to wear that uniform. Frank's humility, his quiet courage, reminded James that his role didn't end with the uniform. It was about what he carried forward: compassion, resilience, and the willingness to make a difference, even in the smallest ways. The snowflakes swirled in the beams of his headlights, and James allowed his mind to wander back to the faces he had seen tonight. The young mother with her sleeping child, who had found a way to show gratitude despite her exhaustion. The waitress whose eyes had softened with understanding as she resolved to reconnect with her brother. The young couple, awkward but genuine in their desire to learn from the moment. And the busboy who, in his nervousness, had found the courage to take a small but meaningful step toward helping others. These weren't just isolated moments, they were ripples in a larger current of change. James smiled faintly, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. He hadn't set out to be anyone's teacher or role model, but life had a way of placing you exactly where you needed to be. He pulled over briefly at a small park, its wooden benches dusted with snow and its playground eerily quiet under the night sky. The cold air hit him as he stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the ground. James walked to a bench and sat down, letting the stillness of the night wash over him. The letter from Corporal Daniel Carter's family rested in his jacket pocket, its presence a comforting weight. He pulled it out, unfolding the worn paper with care. The words, though familiar, felt fresh every time he read them. We pray that others won't take for granted the freedom Daniel fought for. James stared at the letter, his breath visible in the icy air. Freedom. It was a word he had thought about countless times during his service, but it felt different now. It wasn't just about battles won or flags raised, it was about the quiet, everyday moments. The freedom to sit in a diner without fear of judgment. The freedom to extend kindness without hesitation. The freedom to acknowledge someone's sacrifice and be changed by it. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket, his chest swelling with a quiet resolve. Tonight had been a reminder that change didn't come from grand gestures or sweeping movements. It came from moments like these, when people paused, listened, and chose to see each other as human first. James stood and looked up at the sky. The snow continued to fall, the flakes catching the light from a distant street lamp. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a reminder that even in the coldest moments, there was a quiet magic to be found. He climbed back into his truck and turned the key, the engine roaring to life. As he drove through the sleeping town, he thought about what awaited him. The challenges of reintegration, the questions he would have to face, and the weight he would continue to carry. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't carrying it alone. He carried forward the lessons of the evening, the courage to connect, the humility to learn, and the quiet power of kindness. The diner had been a small stop on his journey, but its impact stretched far beyond its walls. James knew he might never see those people again, Frank, the young mother, the waitress, or the busboy, but their faces would stay with him. They were reminders of the good that could come from moments of vulnerability, from choosing to speak when silence felt easier. As the truck rumbled toward the edge of town, James passed a brightly lit church, its stained glass windows glowing against the dark. A sign out front caught his eye, "Be the change you want to see in the world." He smiled softly, the words resonating in a way they hadn't before. Tonight, he had witnessed the beginning of change not just in others, but in himself. And that was enough. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the road ahead, but James didn't mind. The journey was long, and the path wasn't always clear, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. With every mile, every turn, he carried forward the lessons of the evening, the courage to connect, the humility to learn, and the quiet power of kindness.